Welcome to you all. Thanks so much for tuning in. We think that you'll find today's presentation timely and inspiring. I'm Terry Sullivan. I'm the State Director of the Nature Conservancy in New Mexico. I've been with the Conservancy for 28 years in New Mexico. For those of you who aren't completely familiar with us, the Nature Conservancy, we're the largest conservation organization in the world. We work in more than 70 countries and in all 50 states. We've had a program in New Mexico for more than 40 years, and we've had a fantastic track record of success and a wonderful legacy of conservation here in the land of enchantment. Our mission is to conserve the lands and waters that all life needs to survive. And our vision is to leave a sustainable world for future generations. As far as today's presentation, we had originally planned to do this next fall. We were hoping that Florence could come out and join us in person, and we were going to have conversations and presentations in Santa Fe and Albuquerque. But with the disruption that we're experiencing now, we realized that that was probably pretty unlikely. And so we realized, though, that at the same time, this conversation and this topic is so relevant for us all right now as we're seeking solace in nature and looking for a nature fix. And so we thought that, this would be a good time for us to move up the presentation and have it at this point in time because of its relevance. We're really grateful to Florence for her flexibility and willingness to move up this conversation to today. Before we get started, I just wanted to lay out a few ground rules for this webinar. As you can see, all of your microphones are on mute. We do encourage questions, but what you can do is please use the chat box on the right side of your screen, and you can type in your question and push enter. And Sally Hofer, who's managing this conversation for us, will get a copy of the question, and hopefully we'll be able to answer several of your questions in the last 15 minutes of the presentation. But for those of you who we can't answer your questions, we will try to reply to you. We'll do our best to get back to you if you leave your email address in the question. And I also just want to let you know, this is still kind of new technology for us. We think we have it figured out, but just in case there's any problems, we're all in a learning mode right now in a lot of different ways. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, I want to introduce our wonderful guest. It's my pleasure to introduce Florence Williams. Florence is a journalist, an award-winning author, and podcaster. She's a contributing editor at Outside Magazine and a freelance writer for the New York Times Magazine, National Geographic, and numerous other publications. She's also the writer and host of two Gracie Award-winning Audible original series, Breasts Abound and The 3-Day Effect, as well as Outside Magazine's Double X Factor podcast. So we're here today to discuss Florence's most recent book, The Nature Fix, Why Nature Makes Us Happier, Healthier, and More Creative. So I want to welcome Florence. So, the first obvious question, Florence, for you is, how are you coping in a lockdown? And are you finding your own urgent biophilia fix?
I am desperate for biophilia. I am more in need of it, than I have been in a long time. And I am using the lessons from my book every chance I get. I find that, the days are up and down, right? Some days I feel great. Some days I feel terrible. And I try to stick to a routine of sometimes I go for 3 walks a day after meals. And they're short walks, but they're walks in which I try to hear the birds. I take some deep breaths. I grab these bunches of neighbors' leaves. And, and occasionally I can go with a friend too and have some social distancing, social time, right? And there's no place really to do that now except outside. So I'm super grateful for the green spaces that we have in my town.
Yeah, I've noticed, as being at home, we've now been working from home and largely under a stay-at-home order in New Mexico for about 10 weeks now. And what I have found is, for me, I'm finding some solace in nature, and my nature fix just simply in the backyard, and I'm fortunate because I have a really wonderful backyard with lots of neotropical migratory birds coming through right now. But what are your thoughts on, for people who can't necessarily get out right now, either because there's still a stay-at-home order or physically they can't manage it? What are some of your thoughts and suggestions about how they can get their nature fix from their own immediate environment?
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, there has been some science suggesting that there are things we can do even inside our homes. Even very small micro doses of nature can bring us some restorative benefits. So houseplants, I have more houseplants now. I am gardening a little more than I usually do. Also, we can play birdsong. You can play audio tape of birdsong. There are apps where you can play birdsong. I didn't mention I am also meditating more than I usually do, and sometimes I do that to nature sounds. Again, this like working near a window, putting your desk near a window, taking quick breaks to look outside that window, look up at the clouds. Yeah. Wherever you are, you can probably get to a point where you can see the sky. So check out the sunset if you can, welcome in the day. These rituals can remind us that we're part of the cycles of life. And I think we can find a lot of comfort there.
Right. One of the other things that really struck me from your presentation, especially today, was the concept of the nature pyramid. And, the idea that we've all been, I think, raised, many of us, with the idea of a food pyramid and other kinds of pyramids. But, this concept that there are different components to a holistic ability to engage with and get benefit from nature. And what it reminded me of, it's something that we haven't necessarily been consciously trying to do over the years, but in the Nature Conservancy in New Mexico, we've kind of created our own conservation pyramid of working, first and most importantly on very large landscapes, whether it's a 1 million acre protected grassland in New Mexico and Mexico, or 600,000 acres of forest restoration in northern New Mexico, but all the way down to smaller activities like tree planting in Albuquerque. Yeah. That in Albuquerque, while they do have great local access to parks, unfortunately, they have one of the lowest levels of tree canopy. And so that's something that we've been working hard with the city of Albuquerque to try to rectify. All the way down to our Santa Fe Canyon Preserve, which is just kind of at the top of Old Canyon Road. And what we've seen over the last few weeks is a real increase in the number of people who are visiting some of these smaller little park areas. And for the most part, they're doing it in a conscious way, and they're wearing face protection and they're social distancing. But it really does kind of strike a chord and remind us of the importance of doing conservation work at multiple scales. Do you have any thoughts on kind of where you think conservation needs to go or needs to be at this point in time and moving forward as we're all trying to adapt to these new realities?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that a lot of conservationists are sort of recognizing that there's a very strong argument to be made in the health benefits of access to nature. And I think access is going to become an increasingly important issue, right? As we see social inequities, as we see health inequities, and they're really related. If we believe that exposure to nature is critical for sort of being your best human self, then it becomes really important to make sure that everyone can get to nature. So I feel that urban nature is actually a very important priority right now, as much as I also believe I love wilderness, and I don't think we can give up on that. And we need large landscapes for habitat and for wildlife. But I don't think we can neglect the urban nature piece. It's just going to become more and more important. And of course, if we want to build up a connection and a deep love of nature among the next generation, we have to make sure that young people can get to nature.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. One of the other concepts that really struck me, one of your early chapters in your book talked about your trip to Japan and your forest bathing experience there. And I think that's really easy to envision, how going into a rainforest or something and immersing yourself would be a really quick way to get a nature fix, because you're just completely immersed in that nature. For those of us in New Mexico, though, we have a variety of different landscapes. We have great rivers and we have wonderful forests, but probably the predominant ecosystem type or habitat type here is kind of arid lands or grasslands. And so do you think that you can get an equivalent experience from spending time in arid lands as you can in a tropical rainforest?
I definitely spend a lot of time talking about forests in my book, because that is where some of the science has been happening, especially in Asia. But I mentioned that neuroscientist in Utah, Dr. David Strayer, and he's actually done a lot of his studies in arid landscapes. So I love to point to those. His brainwave monitoring study with the veterans was on Lador Canyon and the Green River. Definitely a very arid desert landscape. And yeah, he saw some really interesting changes in the brain in those landscapes, as well as people being sort of more creative, improving their scores on tests of creativity up to 50% after backpacking trips, 3 days, after 3 days outside in nature. And that was in an arid landscape. So, one thing I've really learned is that we all have different preferences. And I think evolution has really allowed for that. Some of us feel most at home in a forest. Some of us feel most at home in a desert. Humans are incredibly adaptable. That's the way we're supposed to be. And, whether it's sort of about personal culture or about deep evolution, we can learn to love anything and to find benefit from anything. And so what I really encourage people to do is know yourself. Like, pay attention to where you feel fantastic. Pay attention to the landscapes and the elements of nature that really sing to you. So it may be that you love looking at a vast view, or it may be that you feel really better in sort of an intimate sort of creekside environment. But pay attention to how you feel, and then please go there.
Right. Yeah, I think that's great advice. And thinking about this as a parent, I've went through a period where I had 2 preteen young boys and teenage boys, and there certainly was a period there where their happy space seemed to be in front of a video screen.
Yes.
Holding a Game Boy, and then of course now with their cell phones or their smartphones. And so what's your observation about that? How can we help teens and young people in general kind of disengage, especially at this point in time, from this dominant video culture that we have?
Yeah.
I know I tried a lot of different things and not everything really worked. And so I'd love to get your insight as to how we can best.
Sure. Yeah, a lot of parents, so many parents ask me that question. How do I get my teenagers outside? They won't go. And mostly I tell those parents to just relax. Teenagers are focused on teenagers. They're very peer oriented. They need to interact with each other. They're going to go through periods of time when they are not so outwardly focused onto nature. And that's okay. If we've managed to instill a real connection to nature while they're younger and while they're really hungry for it, and in fact, just naturally inclined to run around outside, which really pretty much every kid is if we can expose them early enough, they will come back to nature as they need to, as they grow up. May not be when they're 15 and 16 so much, but they will find comfort and adventure in nature again.
Yeah, that's great advice. I'm starting to see that with my sons.
We're coming around.
They're coming around, and they talk about their experiences, whether from when they were young and we went to Big Bend, for instance, hiking, or the hikes that we did in the mountains that at the time seemed like it was absolute drudgery. But now it's great as a parent to realize, oh, that did plant a seed, and that did create this sense of value in nature. So good to hear that there's some scientific foundation for that.
They'll be okay.
Well, thanks, Florence, so much for this conversation. What we wanted also to do, obviously, was to leave some time, set aside some time for questions from the people who have tuned in. And again, I'm sure we probably will not have time to answer all of these questions, but we'll absolutely do our best to get back to everyone after this event in the next few days. So what I'd like to do is turn the conversation over to Sally Hofer, who is our Nature Conservancy Donor Relations Manager for New Mexico. And she's going to help coordinate and facilitate a bit of a question and answer portion. Sally will be taking questions from the chat and then presenting them to Florence, I guess, as she filters them out. So Sally and Florence, I'll turn the stage over to you guys for these next few minutes.
Thanks, Terry. Hi, Florence.
Hi, Sally.
Okay, so first question, really interesting question. Have you found any discussion of the biophilia effect of wood buildings during your research?
The biophilia effect of what kind of building?
Of wood buildings.
Oh, wood buildings. Well, there's a whole movement in architecture to incorporate biophilic elements into building design. And there is quite a bit of research, actually, and some of it's really interesting. I mentioned that people who work near natural daylight tend to be more alert. So that's one thing. I think there's studies showing that people who are surrounded by houseplants, which a lot of buildings are now incorporating, and green walls, even sort of break rooms. Google campuses now in Zurich and Tel Aviv have these break rooms that are just filled with tropical plants, wall to ceiling to floor to ceiling. And there is some research indicating that people are more productive after breaks in those environments. Certainly in hospital settings, there have been some interesting studies showing that when doctors and nurses can take a break in a nature-filled area like a courtyard or a rooftop garden, that when they go back to work, they make fewer mistakes, which is critically important for that worker community. There have been some studies showing that houseplants actually also make people behave in more pro-social ways. So, for example, there have been some lab studies where participants are asked to sort of play a video game in a room without plants, and then the same video game in a room with plants. And they work much better in groups. And they give away, for example, more lottery tickets when they're surrounded by plants. So it's pretty interesting.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay, is there a difference across cultures in terms of attitudes towards being in nature and outside? And how are we different?
Yeah, that was one thing that really interested me when I went to different cultures around the world. Different researchers from different cultures were asking very different questions. And I felt like in Asia and in Western Europe, researchers were really interested in stress reduction and mental health. So there was this recognition of the tremendous toll that mental health problems can take on a population. For example, that the horticulture garden I went to in Denmark that was a program I visited that's specifically for people with such severe depression that they can't go back to work. And yet after 12 weeks of this program, over 60% of them are able to return to work, which is a higher success rate than they see for any other intervention. And so there's just this recognition that if you can prevent those kinds of problems to begin with, or if you can treat them well, you have a more productive economy. Whereas in our country, we're not, in the United States, there isn't very much emphasis at all on preventative medicine. And in fact, a lot of the research looking into the effects of nature were much more about how do we get workers to be more productive? How can we get them to work harder, work faster, work better? And so you see, for example, the campus of Facebook and many of these kind of enlightened campuses now incorporating rooftop gardens and these outdoor break rooms, indoor garden-y break rooms, walking trails on the roof. This isn't really to make their workers happy, it's to make them more productive. And so there's kind of a different focus in these different cultures.
Thank you. Do you mind going back to the nature pyramid slide in your presentation and reviewing what that pyramid looks like?
Sure. It's going to take me a minute to get back there.
And while you get back, can you just share the name of your podcasts are again?
Oh, yeah. I've done one based on my first book, which was an environmental health book, and the podcast is through Audible. It's called Breasts Unbound. I think that one's now sort of available also on iTunes for free. I did another one for Audible called The 3-Day Effect, and that one is based on the Nature Fix book and really looks at this kind of wilderness 3-day effect and what happens to our brains when we're outside for that long. And then I also did one for Outside Magazine based on women and sort of extreme athletes called The Double X Factor. And these are on my website too, which is florencewilliams.com. So, okay, so here is our nature pyramid. I did go through this pretty quickly. So at the top, as I mentioned, are these kinds of rare, wilderness doses that might be a multi-day excursion. These are the places where we can really think about who we are. We can work through our self-concept. We can, many cultures around the world have rites of passage, right? So from the journey from adolescence to adulthood, based in, multi-days outside, separated from kind of civilization. This is a space of reflection and sort of meaning. It can be very profound and important, but not necessarily something, that we're able to do or need to do, multiple times a year. Then you have in the middle of the pyramid are sort of these immersive doses of nature, but not all day. So maybe a visit to a park, like a regional park or a large park, maybe, going for a picnic for a couple of hours. There's a lot of research in this part of the pyramid too. Places like Finland have now come up with these public health recommendations that people spend 5 hours a month in these parks, which is like 30 to 40 minutes a day, or kind of more in one chunk. The UK came out with a study last year, really interesting one, recommending 2 hours a week. So people in the UK seem to need more nature and this is really for just mental health maintenance, prevention of depression, probably because they're going through Brexit. Who knows? They need a little more nature. I'm not aware of a study like that in the US, but I think right now we could probably all argue that we need doses of nature every single day. At least I know I do. And then at the bottom, the base of the pyramid, this is really our bread and butter, right? This is our everyday, nearby, street side pocket parks. These are the trees on our street. These are the schoolyards that our kids are exposed to every day. These are the parks down the street. These are how we drive and walk to work. This is like the amount of sort of biota, right, in our cities. And it turns out that this is actually really critical because it's the nature that we see every day.
Just wanted to jump in quickly and highlight one of the participants asked a question about golf courses and whether or not playing golf. It seems like golf could fit into that pyramid either on the weekly or the daily end of the pyramid there.
Yeah, there's no question that a golf course, there's a reason people like homes on golf courses, and there's a reason we like to be on golf courses. It really speaks to our sort of deep evolutionary brain that likes this combination of sort of prospect and refuge, right? So we get these views and vistas of meadows and sort of savanna, and then we get the trees. And but it's like anything. If you're outside and all you're focused on is, you know, kind of your stroke, it's, you know, it's your handicap, it's your competition with people you're playing golf with. Maybe you're like listening to music in your golf cart. If you're not really being mindful in the space, you're not going to get as many benefits out of it.
Thanks, Florence. All right, so how do we embed outside time on K through 12 school campuses when we return to schools in the future? Do you have any ideas on a policy level for this?
Yeah, I do. I have a couple of main ideas. One is we need greener schoolyards. So right now, there's so many schoolyards that just look awful, right? No one has bothered to landscape them. No one has planted anything. The kids are not learning about planting or gardening or anything growing. There are some wonderful sort of organizations that are out there trying to help schoolyards, help schools green their schoolyards. And actually there's some really interesting studies showing that if you take one school, same kids in it, it has a brown schoolyard, you green it up, the test scores go up. So same school, same family, same kids, test scores go up if you green the schoolyards. So that's pretty interesting. So that's one thing. The other thing is they need more time outside. They just need more recess. I went to Finland, and in Finland has some of the highest test scores in the world. It's always in the top sort of 5 of test scores. And there are all these theories about why that is. And people say, oh, it's because the teachers are paid well, or, you know, the students are well behaved and sort of homogeneous. But if you talk to the teachers will say, actually, these kids, for every 45 minutes of instruction, they get 15 minutes of recess. So they have 5 recesses a day. And this is in 6th grade there. And the teachers say, you know, if we didn't let them outside for 15 minutes every hour, they wouldn't sit still and they wouldn't pay attention. And then I went to a 6th grade classroom here in Indiana, and I gave a talk to the whole 6th grade. And I said, how many of you, how much recess do you get every day? And you know what they said? This is in 6th grade. I think it's 0 recess in Indiana. Okay, so that's 2. And then the other is, I think, environmental ed. I mean, it should just be part of the curriculum. Kids should be outside. They should be learning about their environment. You know, if kids love to categorize things, they love to name things, you know, why not have all these benefits kind of work together? And in fact, Oregon has this fantastic, I think it's Prop 99, where they just dedicated funding for outdoor school so that every single kid in the whole state is supposed to have a week of outdoor school every year for these kids in, I think it's 4th and 5th grade. So that's really to scale, and that's really going to make a difference.
Thanks, Florence. That's fascinating. I know I should spend 15 minutes outside every hour too.
Yeah, me too.
So have there been any studies? Oh, let's see. Have there been any studies on persons whose jobs are primarily done outside, for instance, farmers, forest, or park rangers, and their emotional status compared to office type workers or indoor positions?
That's a good question. I'm not aware of too many studies of outdoor workers. I will say that, you know, your mental state really matters, you know, for how many benefits you're going to get outside. And if you have a job that you don't love, and that's hard and that's exhausting, you know, you're certainly not going to get the sort of same restorative benefits. You might get some vitamin D, but I think, you know, no, I mean, nature, just being in nature it's not necessarily a guarantee to mental health. And in fact, if you look at rural parts of the country, right, they have more severe mental health and physical health problems than people in cities. And that's because of access to medical care. It's because of access to wealth. So there are actually many more factors that play a role here.
Thank you. And do you have any information on how the brain responds to nature compared to how it responds to music?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't think I can really drill down on that. I think there are so many specific brain regions that respond to music. I do know that there are some similarities, of course, between music and bird song. and there are some neuroscientists who have looked at that. Our brains, because our brains are primed to listen to language, we actually are also very responsive to birdsong. But the interesting thing is, because we cannot understand the birdsong, we don't focus on it enough to make it sort of a cognitive load. And so pleasant birdsong becomes this very relaxing sort of background soundtrack to us, because we don't feel like compelled to try to interpret it.
Okay, so what is it going to take to get a broader group of people out to get it and open up their minds to this concept of less time on screens and more time outdoors?
Great question. I think it's a multi-part answer. I think a lot of it has to start with children. I think if we can get our kids outside, then they will connect to nature their whole lives. They will, feel comfortable there. They'll want to go there. So some of that is kind of a policy issue. I don't see that necessarily as just a family issue. I see that also as a school issue. And then I think we have to create better quality parks that have access points for people from all different neighborhoods, all different ethnicities, all different cultures. We have to find ways to make these parks inviting and useful, and a place that people from all sorts of different cultures feel comfortable going. And that's going to require some hard work and also a lot of conversation happening on the community level.
Our next question relates to what you were just talking about. And how do we make people feel comfortable in wild spaces if they have a lot of fear around it and haven't been exposed to it at a young age?
It looks like you're never really too old to acquire a love and a comfort with nature. So that's the good news. Certainly it's easier to instill that if you start young. But there are many, many lives that have been changed as adults spending time in nature. So again, I think it's about access. It's about quality of nature. And I also think it's about groups like the Nature Conservancy who are out there making sure that this land is still protected and that we can still get there.
Thanks, Florence. Speaking about changing gears a little bit to the COVID situation, can you still receive the same health benefits from nature while wearing a face mask?
Good question. Yeah, absolutely. Sure. We're not necessarily eating nature. We could be. Sometimes there are pawpaw trees bearing fruit when I go for a walk. But yeah, we can still smell through these masks as long as we don't have COVID. We can still hear the birds. We can still feel the breeze, on our skin. And we can still actually enjoy real social time with our families or with a couple of friends, depending on what the local guidelines are, for how many people we can be with and where. But absolutely, yeah.
And along the same lines, what if we are sick or confined to a closed space and we can't get outside? What can we do to still get the benefits of nature when we're not actually able to go outside? Or is there a way to?
Well, Florence Nightingale, when she was nursing the sick, recorded in her famous nursing book, I think it was written in the 1850s, that she noticed that her patients who couldn't get out of bed would turn their faces to the window. They followed the light. They needed the light. She eventually figured out these patients might do much better if we can move their beds closer to the light, if we can open their windows, if they can hear nature coming in. And interestingly, in the flu epidemic of 1918, patients in the outdoor hospitals, they had to set up a number of emergency outdoor hospitals. Those patients recovered faster and had lower fatality rates than patients who were inside. So I think the more nature we can bring into our sick rooms and we can help sick people access, that could be a really interesting kind of intervention that's not really being talked about.
Thank you. Turn it back over to Terry now. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Sally. And thanks everyone for your great questions and chat. It's one of the challenges I find is that trying to multitask during this event, and I was trying to read the chat along with listening to Florence, but it was really wonderful, and I'm so grateful for the participation of everybody. Again, if we didn't get to some of those questions, we will try to track you down and get answers to you. But Florence, once again, I really want to thank you both for this presentation today and for your work. You really are an important voice, and we're really grateful for everything that you do, and especially grateful for coming on today. And we do look forward to getting you out to New Mexico.
Please do.
for in-person nature fixes for you and for an audience. And God, I was just thinking we could try to do that outside as opposed to in the Lensic Theater or something like that. Let's try to have an outdoor venue.
Let's try that. Well, thank you so much, Terry. I'm a huge fan of the work that you and the Nature Conservancy are doing there and around the country. I just think it's more critical than ever. And thanks for all you do.
Well, thank you. You know, during listening to your presentation, it reminded me of a lot of the thinking I was doing as we were in stay-at-home mode in my house, and thinking a lot about the concept of resiliency.
Yeah.
And thinking first about how, well, humans are resilient and our societies are resilient, and you hope our economy is resilient. But probably more importantly, from my standpoint, just kind of the resilience of nature and natural systems. And that resiliency, though, is really dependent on actually having protection and conservation, and in many instances, restoration. And that's our work in the Nature Conservancy, and we're so grateful to those of you who have tuned in and our supporters and our members for providing us with the support to allow us to do that important work, because we're finding out it's meaningful not just for nature, but it's also very valuable for people. So thanks again to everybody. I also wanted to highlight a couple other things. A lot of the conversation was about educating students, and we do have a great online resource for parents, grandparents, aunts and uncles who are looking to kind of try to provide some nature education for children while they're in this current situation. So the Nature Conservancy's introduced something called the Nature Lab. It's live, and it's a hub for youth curriculum that gives teachers, students, and families customizable interactive lesson plans to explore and try to understand nature. Some great examples all the way. You can travel to the forests of Borneo, dive into a coral reef, and do a lot of other adventures that we're getting great feedback that from parents, but more importantly from kids, that it's really enjoyable and worthwhile. Secondly, I also want to remind everybody, if you don't have a copy or a digital version of the Nature Fix, Florence's great book, you can find it on any online retailer. And I'd also encourage you to visit florencewilliams.com to learn more about Florence and the full body of her work. You can follow Florence on Facebook at Florence Williams Author, Instagram at Florence999, and Twitter at FlowWill. That's FLOWILL. Is that right, Florence? Great. And then, of course, thank you to all of you again, members of the Nature Conservancy. To find out more about the Nature Conservancy in New Mexico and our upcoming virtual events, of which this was the first. So thanks so much for tuning in for this. You can go ahead and visit nature.org/New Mexico. And so once again, I do want to wish everyone well. I hope you're safe and healthy. And we hope that you can all find time to get your own solace in nature and find your own nature fix. So hopefully many of you can get outside after this and enjoy this incredible afternoon. So thanks again, everybody, and thank you, Florence.
Thank you.